It was Julian's wedding day, the day he had been waiting for years. The sun was shining brightly over Atlanta, illuminating the small church where his ceremony was to take place. Friends, relatives, everyone was there, eager and happy, while he, on the other hand, could barely control the pressure he was feeling. It wasn't the typical nervousness of any groom, but something deeper, a mix of emotions he no longer knew how to explain. Julian was about to experience something that would change his life forever. Today, he would regain his sight. He couldn't remember what it was like to see. He had lost his vision when he was very young, a rare condition that started with visual difficulties and over time left him completely blind. Now, after years of waiting, the surgery he had undergone a few weeks earlier seemed to have been a success. The doctor had said that the recovery would be gradual and that he would see again, but only with time. However, today was the big day. Julian would experience the first flashes of light, colors, and images. The altar was set before him, and he could feel Vanessa, his soon-to-be wife, nearby, like a shadow that had accompanied him in the loneliest and most uncertain moments of his life. She loved him. Always said she loved him. Vanessa had always been the beacon that guided Julian, the constant support in his life. And she would be his wife, the woman he believed to be the missing piece of his puzzle. She completed him, and he had full confidence that she also saw him as the missing piece of hers. The minutes before the ceremony passed slowly. Julian could hear the murmurs of the people around him. He could smell the flowers, hear the sound of his clothes adjusting to his body, and feel the weight of the responsibility of taking the next step. But none of it mattered as much as the image he was beginning to form in his mind about what he would find when his vision was finally restored. How would Vanessa look? Would she be even more beautiful than he imagined? He only knew of her love, the way she made him feel secure, but he didn't know what she truly looked like. The curiosity, mixed with an even greater anxiety, took over him. The doctor had said his sight would be restored slowly. The process would be like waking up from a long, dark dream, like a curtain slowly opening, revealing a new reality. That's what he expected. Today he would begin to see not just with his eyes, but with his soul. And the first thing he would see would be her, his wife, his beloved Vanessa. When the signal sounded and the music began to play, Julian's emotions were palpable. The first steps of the woman of his life were the steps he had waited to hear. The sound of her heels clicking on the floor, softly echoing in the church, was a melody he knew by heart. He didn't need to see to recognize it, but as he couldn't help but think, the question was there, hanging in the air. What would he see when he opened his eyes? He could hardly wait to find the answer. It was at that moment that he felt her touch, the light pressure of her hands, the sweet perfume that mixed with the sacred atmosphere. Vanessa's voice was soft, yet filled with emotion. "I love you, Julian. We will live our dream together. Now you will see what you've always imagined." Julian wanted to smile, but a lump tightened his throat. The pain and anxiety were so great that he could barely hold back the tears. And as the priest began to speak, Julian closed his eyes. He closed them to once again feel Vanessa's embrace, to allow his heart to calm before the big moment. The ceremony continued, but Julian's mind was far distant in the future he envisioned alongside Vanessa. What would everything be like now? What would he see? When the moment arrived, he felt the doctor's touch on his hand. It was the signal. It was time to open his eyes. Everything was about to change. And so, with a deep sigh, Julian opened his eyes. But what he saw wasn't what he had expected. It was Julian's wedding day, the day he had been waiting for years. The sun was shining brightly over Atlanta, illuminating the small church where his ceremony was to take place. Friends, relatives, everyone was there, eager and happy, while he, on the other hand, could barely control the pressure he was feeling. It wasn't the typical nervousness of any groom, but something deeper, a mix of emotions he no longer knew how to explain. Julian was about to experience something that would change his life forever. Today, he would regain his sight. He couldn't remember what it was like to see. He had lost his vision when he was very young, a rare condition that started with visual difficulties and, over time, left him completely blind. Now, after years of waiting, the surgery he had undergone a few weeks earlier seemed to have been a success. The doctor had said that the recovery would be gradual and that he would see again, but only with time. However, today was the big day. Julian would experience the first flashes of light, colors, and images. The altar was set before him, and he could feel Vanessa, his soon-to-be wife, nearby, like a shadow that had accompanied him in the loneliest and most uncertain moments of his life. She loved him, always said she loved him. Vanessa had always been the beacon that guided Julian, the constant support in his life. And she would be his wife, the woman he believed to be the missing piece of his puzzle. She completed him, and he had full confidence that she also saw him as the missing piece of hers. The minutes before the ceremony passed slowly. Julian could hear the murmurs of the people around him. He could smell the flowers, hear the sound of his clothes adjusting to his body, and feel the weight of the responsibility of taking the next step. But none of it mattered as much as the image he was beginning to form in his mind about what he would find when his vision was finally restored. How would Vanessa look? Would she be even more beautiful than he imagined? He only knew of her love, the way she made him feel secure, but he didn't know what she truly looked like. The curiosity, mixed with an even greater anxiety, took over him. The doctor had said his sight would be restored slowly. The process would be like waking up from a long, dark dream, like a curtain slowly opening, revealing a new reality. That's what he expected. Today he would begin to see, not just with his eyes, but with his soul. And the first thing he would see would be her, his wife, his beloved Vanessa. When the signal sounded and the music began to play, Julian's emotions were palpable. The first steps of the woman of his life were the steps he had waited to hear. The sound of her heels clicking on the floor, softly echoing in the church, was a melody he knew by heart. He didn't need to see to recognize it, but as he couldn't help but think, the question was there, hanging in the air. What would he see when he opened his eyes? He could hardly wait to find the answer. It was at that moment that he felt her touch, the light pressure of her hands, the sweet perfume that mixed with the sacred atmosphere. Vanessa's voice was soft, yet filled with emotion. "I love you, Julian. We will live our dream together. Now you will see what you've always imagined." Julian wanted to smile, but a lump tightened his throat. The pain and anxiety were so great that he could barely hold back the tears, and as the priest began to speak, Julian closed his eyes. He closed them to once again feel Vanessa's embrace, to allow his heart to calm before the big moment. The ceremony continued, but Julian's mind was far distant. In the future, he envisioned alongside Vanessa. What would everything be like now? What would he see? When the moment arrived, he felt the doctor's touch on his hand. It was the signal. It was time to open his eyes. Everything was about to change. And so, with a deep sigh, Julian opened his eyes. But what he saw wasn't what he had expected. Part 2. The revelation, the brightness of the light was blinding, almost painful. Julian blinked several times, trying to adjust his eyes to the intensity of the new sight. He felt a slight pressure in his chest, as if the air around him had become denser, heavier. But gradually the light softened, and he began to distinguish the first shapes. Silhouettes, patches of color, some lights. Then, slowly, the details began to take form. He looked ahead, and what he saw was not what he had imagined. Vanessa was there, just as she had always been in his mind, but something was wrong. He knew her by voice, by touch, by gestures, but now, before him, the image seemed distorted. She was smiling, but the smile didn't look genuine. Her eyes were fixed on him, but there was something in the way she looked that unsettled him. Julian blinked again, trying to understand, trying to adjust his perception, but the image was clear. Something was out of place. Vanessa was wearing a white dress that seemed to glow in the light, but the way she moved wasn't natural. It was as if something was forcing her movements, a slight rigidity in each step. Julian could feel the weight of her gaze upon him, but now there was tension, a coldness that he had never noticed before. She never seemed cold, but at that moment there was something about her that made him feel distant, detached. Those were the first images of his life, the first colors, the first figures. But instead of finding relief and happiness, Julian felt a wave of unease wash over him. He didn't know what was happening, but the feeling of something wrong was palpable. He tried to ignore the thoughts and focused on her, the woman he imagined to be his life partner. Maybe it was the nerves of the situation. Maybe it was the impact of the sudden vision. But he couldn't help but wonder. Who was Vanessa, really? Julian, are you okay? Vanessa's soft voice asked, but there was something artificial in the way she spoke, something that didn't make sense. He gave a forced smile, trying to hide his confusion. Yeah, I'm fine. But the words came out without conviction. The insecurity took over him. He tried to associate the image he was seeing with the woman he loved, but the details didn't align. Her smile seemed painted, not genuine. The sparkle in her eyes seemed dull, without the depth he knew from their conversations late at night. She never seemed cold, but now there was something in her that made him feel distant. The ceremony went on, but Julian couldn't focus on the priest's words, the music, or the people around him. All he could think about was one thing. What was he seeing? And who was this woman he was about to marry? Vanessa, noticing the uncertain look in Julian's eyes, stepped closer, and her smile seemed even more forced, as if she were trying to hide something. But what was it? Julian tried to keep calm, focus on the good things, the promises they had made to each other, but more and more, he found himself lost in a sea of questions. Was he seeing the truth? Or was it the impact of the surgery, the confusion of the first moments of vision? Either way, what once seemed like a perfect dream was now beginning to feel like a nightmare in disguise. Vanessa leaned in to kiss him, and he felt the coldness of her lips. The kiss which he had once imagined as the pinnacle of shared happiness now felt like a weight, something distant, without the passion he had expected. He pulled away slightly and looked at her, trying to find some explanation in her eyes. But instead of the answers he sought, he found more questions. What was happening? Why didn't he feel that connection, that warmth, that closeness he always imagined? The wedding, which should have been the pinnacle of his happiness, now seemed to be falling apart before him. And the only thing he knew for sure was that the answers were there, somewhere, within the woman he thought he knew. But now he needed courage. Courage to see the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Julian couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off. He had regained his sight, but it was as if the veil of darkness had been lifted only to reveal a new kind of blindness. A blindness to the truth, to the reality of the woman standing before him. Vanessa was still there, smiling, her hands holding his in what seemed like a comforting gesture, but the warmth he once felt had turned cold, distant, foreign. He couldn't help but replay every moment in his mind, the late-night conversations, the promises, the love they had built together. All of it had seemed so real, so perfect. How could that all be the illusion now, when the world he was seeing with his eyes felt so different? Vanessa, still holding his hands, leaned in and whispered in his ear, "Julian, what's wrong? You're acting strange." "Everything's perfect, can't you see?" He nodded, his mouth dry. "Yeah, I guess I'm still adjusting." But the truth was, Julian wasn't adjusting to the new world of sight. He was adjusting to a world that didn't align with everything he had felt up until that moment. The things he had heard and touched seemed to clash with what he now saw. Vanessa stepped back, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she could sense the shift in his demeanor. He wanted to explain, wanted to tell her that something felt wrong, that something about her seemed different, but how could he? How could he explain the way she looked now, the way her smile seemed forced, and the way her eyes, once full of warmth and compassion, now seemed guarded, distant, even calculating? The ceremony continued, but Julian's focus was gone. He couldn't hear the vows being exchanged, the priest's words fading into the background. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears, the blood rushing to his face as he tried to steady himself. He tried to look at Vanessa, to search her face for something familiar, something that would reassure him that she was the woman he had loved all these years, but nothing came. The woman he thought he knew had slipped away, and in her place stood someone he couldn't recognize. As the ceremony reached its end, Julian's nerves only heightened. How was he supposed to marry someone whose face felt like a stranger's? How could he promise to spend his life with someone whose very presence made him question everything he had believed about their love? The moment they exchanged rings, Julian's hands trembled. The weight of the gold ring felt like a burden, a weight that he wasn't sure he could bear. The vows were spoken. The priest declared them husband and wife. But Julian's mind was far from the joyful celebration of their union. His thoughts were consumed with one question. Who was this woman he had vowed to marry? After the ceremony, during the reception, Julian tried to engage with the guests, to smile and pretend that everything was fine. But every glance he stole at Vanessa only made his stomach tighten. She was the same woman, in the same dress, with the same smile, but there was a coldness in her eyes that sent a chill down his spine. He watched her as she spoke to the guests, laughed at jokes, and moved with an elegance that once took his breath away. But now it felt like he was watching a stranger. Something about the way she interacted with others made his skin crawl. Her gestures were too calculated, her laugh too rehearsed. He had seen her in so many situations before, but now he saw her with a clarity that felt almost unbearable. Vanessa caught his gaze across the room and smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. She tilted her head slightly, as if she was waiting for him to come to her, to return to the man he had been just hours ago. But Julian couldn't do it. Not now. He couldn't be the man who had been blind to her for so long. Not anymore. As the night went on, Julian excused himself from the crowd. He needed to get away, to think. He stepped outside the church, the cool evening air hitting his skin like a shock to his system. He stood there, breathing deeply, trying to ground himself, trying to make sense of the chaos swirling in his mind. And then, as if by fate, Vanessa appeared beside him. She stood silently for a moment, her presence overwhelming, yet somehow distant. Julian turned to her, trying to steady his breath. His words, "Vanessa, is everything okay?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Vanessa looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Julian saw something flicker in her eyes, something dark, something sharp. It was gone before he could fully process it, but it left him shaken. "Of course." "Julian," she said softly, her tone almost too sweet. "Everything's perfect. Why wouldn't it be?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. The words were stuck in his throat. The realization that something was terribly wrong, too overpowering to ignore. Vanessa's smile faded slightly, but she quickly recovered, stepping closer to him. "You're just tired, that's all." "Don't worry, everything will be fine," she said, her voice low and almost comforting. But to Julian, it sounded rehearsed, as if she had said it 1,000 times before, to someone else. Julian swallowed hard, forcing himself to maintain composure. But inside, his world was collapsing. There was no way to ignore it any longer. He was married to a woman who didn't feel like his wife. She wasn't the person he thought he had loved all these years. But what was he going to do now? He had promised to spend his life with her. He had given her his heart, his trust. Yet now, all he could feel was a sinking sense of dread. The night went on, but Julian couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. And as the moonlight bathed the streets of Atlanta, he couldn't help but wonder if the truth would ever come to light. The days that followed the wedding were nothing like Julian had imagined. There was no blissful honeymoon, no quiet moments of tenderness shared between husband and wife. Instead, the space between him and Vanessa seemed to grow wider with each passing hour. Every time he looked at her, there was something different, something distant that pulled her further away from him. At first, Julian chalked it up to the stress of the wedding and the whirlwind of emotions that came with regaining his sight. After years of living in darkness, he had finally seen the world in all its detail, and the contrast was overwhelming. But as the days wore on, he realized that the discomfort he felt wasn't about his newfound vision. It was about Vanessa. She was no longer the woman he had fallen in love with. The conversations they had once shared so freely now felt strained. They spoke less, and when they did, the words seemed hollow, devoid of the intimacy they had once shared. She no longer spoke to him with the tenderness he had grown accustomed to, her voice colder, her gestures more controlled. It was as if she was playing a part, acting out the role of a loving wife without truly feeling it. At night, when Julian lay in bed beside her, he felt a growing emptiness. The warmth he used to feel in her presence was now replaced by a gnawing sense of loneliness. It wasn't just that she wasn't the woman he thought she was. It was that she was becoming someone he didn't even recognize. One evening, Julian came home early from work, hoping to surprise Vanessa with dinner. He had planned a quiet night, just the two of them, to try and reconnect. But when he entered their apartment, the sight that greeted him stopped him dead in his tracks. Vanessa was sitting at the kitchen table, her phone in hand, speaking to someone in a low, hushed voice. She didn't seem to notice him at first. Julian stood frozen in the doorway, watching her. There was something about the way she spoke, the way her tone shifted when she responded, that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Her words were clipped, and she laughed at something the person on the other end of the line said. But it wasn't the friendly, affectionate laugh he had once found endearing. It was cold, almost calculating. And as she looked up and saw him standing there, her expression shifted instantly, as if the warmth she had shown to the person on the other end of the line was a mere act. "Julian, you're home early," she said, her voice suddenly sweet, almost too sweet. She quickly ended the call and placed the phone down. But the moment had already been shattered. Julian's stomach twisted. He could feel his pulse quicken, a wave of unease washing over him. Why was she acting like this? Why was she hiding something? Who were you talking to? He asked, his voice steady but laced with suspicion. Vanessa smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just a friend," she replied casually. Nothing to worry about, but Julian wasn't convinced. The way she had looked at him just then, her eyes cold, her smile forced, spoke volumes. He had seen this side of her before, fleeting glimpses of something hidden beneath the surface. But he had ignored it. He had wanted to believe in the woman he thought he knew. But now the cracks in her facade were beginning to show, and Julian couldn't ignore them any longer. Later that evening, after a tense dinner that neither of them truly enjoyed, Julian lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced. What was going on with Vanessa? Who was she really? And why did it feel like he was married to a stranger? His thoughts kept circling back to the phone call he had overheard. It wasn't just the secrecy that bothered him, it was the way Vanessa had acted afterward, as though she was caught in a lie. And the more he thought about it, the more questions he had. Was she hiding something from him? Was there someone else in her life? The thought made his stomach churn, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. The next day, Julian decided to confront her. He needed answers, but he also knew it wasn't going to be easy. Vanessa was good at hiding things. She was good at pretending everything was fine, even when it wasn't. But Julian had changed. The man he was before, blind, trusting, oblivious, was gone. And now the truth was all that mattered. When he arrived home that evening, Vanessa was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine. The familiar sight of her made his heart ache, but he knew he couldn't let that stop him. "Vanessa," he said, his voice steady but firm, "we need to talk." She looked up at him, her eyes flickering with something that Julian couldn't quite place. For a moment she didn't say anything, just studied him. Then she put the magazine down and stood up, her expression shifting into something more guarded. "What about?" she asked, her tone neutral. Julian took a deep breath. I overheard your conversation last night. Who were you talking to? Vanessa's eyes flashed with irritation, but she quickly masked it with a smile. It was nothing, Julian. You're making a big deal out of nothing. No, he said, his voice rising slightly. It's not nothing. I need to know the truth. Who were you talking to? For a moment there was silence between them, the tension thick in the air. Then Vanessa finally spoke, her voice lower, colder than before. You're paranoid, Julian. Maybe it's time you let go of your obsession with this. Everything's fine. I'm fine. But Julian wasn't convinced. The coldness in her voice, the way she refused to meet his eyes, it all confirmed his suspicions. Something was happening, and he wasn't going to let it go. That night, after Vanessa went to bed, Julian sat in the living room, his thoughts swirling. He couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease, the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. And deep down, he knew that he had to uncover the truth no matter what it cost him. The days that followed that night felt like a slow unraveling of everything Julian had thought was real. Vanessa continued to act distant, her behavior colder and more controlled, but Julian couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface. Every glance she gave him, every word she spoke, seemed carefully crafted, as if she were playing a role one that no longer felt genuine. The unease that had settled in his chest after the phone call continued to grow, festering like an open wound. Julian began to observe her more closely, studying her movements, her expressions, trying to catch glimpses of the woman he had once thought he knew. But every time he thought he was close to understanding, she slipped further away. One evening, Julian decided to take a walk alone to clear his head. He needed space, time to think. As he walked through the streets, the world seemed to swirl around him, a blur of shapes and sounds that no longer felt comforting. His mind was consumed with questions. Who was Vanessa really? What was she hiding? And why did he feel like he was losing his grip on everything? He had never been one to doubt his instincts, but with Vanessa, everything seemed clouded. It wasn't just that she was hiding something, it was that she was actively keeping him in the dark. And that realization stung more than he cared to admit. When he returned home, he found Vanessa sitting on the couch, her phone in her hand. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice soft, but there was a hint of something he couldn't place. "Just out for a walk," Julian replied, trying to sound casual. But his mind was racing. He needed answers, and he was done waiting. "I don't like you going out alone like that," she said, her tone shifting slightly, almost imperceptibly. "What if something happens to you?" Julian met her gaze, his suspicion growing. "Vanessa, we need to talk." She raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting him to press. "About what?" "About everything," he said, his voice firm. "About the phone call. About why you're acting like this. Why you're so distant." She froze for a moment, then put her phone down with deliberate slowness. Her hands trembled slightly, a tell that Julian caught immediately. "Julian, I told you before," she said, her voice rising defensively. "Nothing is wrong. You're just overthinking this. Stop obsessing." Julian stepped closer to her, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm not obsessing, Vanessa. I'm just trying to understand what's going on with you." "With us." Vanessa's eyes hardened, and Julian saw the walls she had been building around herself. For the first time, he realized how much he had been blind to. "You want to know what's going on?" she snapped. "I'm not happy, Julian. I'm not happy in this marriage, and I haven't been for a long time." The words hit Julian like a physical blow. He staggered back slightly, his mind racing to process what she had just said. "What do you mean?" "I don't love you," Vanessa interrupted, her voice quiet but full of finality. "I thought I did, but the truth is, I never did. This marriage, it was never real. It was something I thought I wanted. But now I see that it was just a mistake." Julian couldn't speak. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the air thick with the weight of her words. He had believed in her. He had trusted her. And now it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. Vanessa stood up, her movements stiff. "I don't know what you thought you were going to find, Julian. But this isn't it. I'm not who you thought I was." Tears welled up in Julian's eyes, not from anger, but from a deep, crushing sorrow. How had he been so blind? How had he missed the signs? But before he could respond, Vanessa turned away from him, her back to him. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, almost as if she were apologizing for something that wasn't her fault. "But I can't keep pretending anymore." Julian stood there, his mind a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and pain. He didn't know what to say, how to fix this, how to make sense of the woman standing in front of him, the woman he had married, the woman he had given his heart to, only to find out that she had never truly given hers in return. The room felt cold, despite the warmth of the evening, and Julian realized that the woman he thought he knew, the woman he had once trusted with his heart, had been a stranger all along. The next few days felt like a blur to Julian. He barely ate, barely slept. His mind couldn't escape the words Vanessa had spoken that night. "I'm not happy. I'm not happy in this marriage." She had torn apart the very foundation he had believed was solid. How had he been so blind? How had he not seen the cracks forming long before that moment? He spent his days going through the motions, going to work, answering emails, pretending to be the man everyone thought he was. But inside it felt like a storm was raging, one that wouldn't settle until everything around him had been washed away. His colleagues noticed the change, the empty look in his eyes, but none of them said anything. They didn't know. None of them knew how close he was to losing everything. At home, Vanessa had become even more distant. She no longer tried to hide the coldness between them. Her smiles had disappeared, replaced by silence and avoidance. The conversations they once shared now felt forced, awkward, as if they were strangers trying to pretend they were something more. One evening, Julian decided to confront her again. He couldn't keep living like this, walking on eggshells, pretending to ignore the elephant in the room. He needed to understand why this had happened, why she had never been honest with him. "Vanessa," he said, his voice quieter than he intended as he entered the living room where she sat, scrolling through her phone. "We need to talk." She didn't look up. "I don't have anything more to say, Julian." Julian's heart raced. "You've been avoiding me, shutting me out. I deserve more than that." Vanessa finally put down her phone, but there was no warmth in her gaze. "You deserve the truth, Julian, and I've already told you everything you need to know. I don't love you. I haven't for a long time. I can't pretend anymore." "But why?" Julian's voice cracked, the weight of her words crushing him. "Why marry me then?" Why go through all of this if you never really loved me? Vanessa paused, her eyes flickering with something, regret, maybe? But she quickly masked it, because I thought I could make it work. I thought I could learn to love you, but it was never enough. Julian's mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of their relationship, all the little moments he had dismissed, the signs he had ignored. But we had good times, Vanessa, didn't we? Her lips curled into a bitter smile. Good times? You mean the times when I pretended to be someone I wasn't? When I did everything I could to make you happy, all the while hating every second of it. The words hit Julian harder than anything else. Pretended to be someone I wasn't. His world tilted, the foundation beneath him cracking once again. Everything he had thought was real had been nothing more than an act, an illusion. You're right, she continued, her voice cold and matter-of-fact. It was all a game to me, a way to get what I wanted. And now that I have it, I'm done. Get what you wanted. Julian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What are you talking about? Vanessa's gaze flickered for a moment, and Julian saw something there, a brief flash of guilt, or maybe something darker. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by her usual indifference. I used you, Julian, she said, her voice low. I knew from the beginning that you were the perfect target. You were a good man, trusting and kind. I needed a way out of my own problems, and you were an easy solution. I thought I could find a way to love you, but I never could. And now I don't have to pretend anymore. Julian's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him like a freight train. He wasn't just a victim of her indifference. He had been a pawn in her game. She had used him to escape something, to build a new life at his expense. Used me? Julian repeated, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. So everything we had, everything we shared, it was just a lie? Vanessa didn't answer. She stood up, her movements stiff, her gaze avoiding his. Goodbye, Julian, she said, turning toward the door. I'm done here. And just like that, she walked out of his life. Julian stood frozen in the living room, his mind spinning, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Vanessa, the woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted, had just shattered everything he had believed in. It felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him, and he was falling, tumbling into an abyss with no end. He collapsed onto the couch, his head in his hands, the weight of it all crashing down on him. The life he had imagined, the future he had envisioned, none of it was real. It had all been a mirage. The days that followed Vanessa's departure were marked by silence and eerie, suffocating silence. Julian felt like he was existing in a state of numbness, his emotions oscillating between anger, disbelief, and deep sorrow. It was as though someone had torn out his heart and left him wandering aimlessly, trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. His friends and family reached out, of course. They called, they texted, they tried to offer support. But Julian didn't have the strength to talk. How could he explain to them that the woman he had married, the woman he had trusted more than anyone, had betrayed him so deeply, that she had never loved him, that she had used him for her own gain? How could he admit that he had been so blind? At work, he went through the motions, trying to act normal, trying to be the person everyone expected him to be. But inside, he was falling apart. Every day felt like a struggle, and he couldn't escape the thought that he had been nothing more than a fool, a pawn in someone else's game. One afternoon, as Julian sat in his office, staring blankly at the computer screen, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Vanessa. "I need to talk to you." His heart skipped a beat. The last thing he wanted was to speak to her. But something inside him, the remnants of the love he had once felt, the desperate need for closure, compelled him to open the message. "What do you want?" The response was immediate. "I made a mistake. I want to explain. Can we meet?" Julian stared at the screen, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to throw his phone across the room and never speak to her again. But another part, the part that still wanted answers, the part that needed to know why, found himself typing a response. Where? The location was set. A small cafe on the edge of town, a place they had gone to a few times during their brief but intense courtship. Julian hadn't thought of it in years, but now, as he stared at the message, he realized that it had been a place of false promises and broken dreams. Still, he agreed to meet her. When Julian arrived at the cafe, he was early, unsure of what to expect. He ordered a coffee and sat at a table by the window, his fingers drumming nervously against the ceramic cup. His thoughts were a jumble. He didn't know what he was hoping for from this meeting. Closure? An explanation? Or perhaps a final moment of clarity to understand why everything had gone so horribly wrong. 10 minutes passed before he saw her walk through the door. Vanessa looked different. Her expression was unreadable, and there was something in her eyes and emptiness that made his stomach churn. She hesitated at the entrance, looking around as if she were searching for something, but when she saw him, her gaze locked on his, and she walked over, her movements stiff and deliberate. "Julian," she said quietly, taking a seat across from him. Her voice lacked the warmth it had once held, replaced by a coldness that made Julian's heart tighten. "I didn't think you'd agree to meet." "I almost didn't," he replied, his voice low. He couldn't help the bitterness that seeped into his words. "But you asked, so here we are." Vanessa's eyes flickered with a brief, almost imperceptible flash of guilt, but she quickly masked it. "I owe you an explanation. You deserve that much." Julian leaned forward, his hands clenched around his coffee cup. "You owe me more than an explanation, Vanessa. You owe me the truth, all of it." Vanessa took a deep breath, her fingers tapping nervously against the table. "I never wanted to hurt you, Julian. I really didn't. But I didn't know how to get out of this. I was in over my head. And I thought I could make it work, but I couldn't. The pressure, the expectations, it was too much." Julian's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragmented puzzle of their relationship. "What do you mean? The pressure? The expectations? You made the choice to marry me, Vanessa. I didn't force you into this. I gave you everything I had, and you—" He stopped, his voice breaking. "You used me. You lied to me." Vanessa's eyes dropped to the table, and for the first time since they had sat down, she seemed to soften. "I know. I never should have gone along with it. I was trapped in a situation that I couldn't get out of. And you, Julian, you were my way out." Julian stared at her, his heart heavy with the weight of her confession. "A way out?" He repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "From what?" Vanessa hesitated for a long moment before answering. "I had debts, Julian. I had people coming after me, people who weren't going to stop until I paid. I thought that if I married you, everything would be okay. I could escape. You were the perfect person to help me hide. You were kind, successful, everything I needed. Julian felt like the air had been knocked out of him. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had given her his heart, his trust, and she had taken it all for her own survival. She had used him as a shield to protect herself from the consequences of her own mistakes. "I thought I could make it work, Julian," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't, and now I'm sorry. I truly am." Julian was silent for a long time, his mind numb from the weight of her words. What was left for him to say? What could he say to a woman who had destroyed everything they had built together? Who had used him as a stepping stone in her own life? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I don't know who you are anymore, Vanessa. I don't know you, and I don't think I ever will." With that, he stood up, leaving his unfinished coffee behind. As he walked out of the cafe, the door chimed softly behind him, and he felt a finality settle over him. It was over. There was no going back. There was no fixing what had been broken. But as Julian walked into the cool evening air, he realized something. He wasn't broken. He was hurt, yes, but he wasn't broken. And no matter how much Vanessa had taken from him, there was still something he had left, his dignity, his self-respect, and that, at least, he could rebuild. Days turned into weeks, and Julian struggled to find any sense of normalcy in his life. His phone, once filled with texts from Vanessa and constant reminders of their life together, was now eerily silent. His world, which had once been consumed by thoughts of her, was now filled with a suffocating quiet that left him restless. He hadn't spoken to anyone in depth since that day at the cafe, when Vanessa had made her confession. His friends had tried to reach out, but he pushed them away, not ready to face their pity or their questions. One evening, as he sat in his dimly lit living room, the stillness weighed heavily on him. It had been a long time since he truly thought about his future. Every decision, every thought had once revolved around her, his marriage, his career, his goals. All of it had been intertwined with the hope that she would stand beside him as they built something together. But now it all felt empty. He had promised himself that he would heal, that he would rebuild his life, but the process felt so much more complicated than he had imagined. How could he possibly begin again after everything that had happened? It was at that moment that his phone buzzed once again. Julian glanced at the screen, surprised to see an unfamiliar number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Julian?" The voice on the other end of the line sent a chill through him. It was Rachel, Vanessa's older sister, whom he had never gotten to know very well. They had met only a handful of times during family gatherings, and she had always been distant, polite, but somewhat guarded. Julian didn't know what to expect from her now. "Rachel," he said, his voice guarded, "what's this about? I know you're probably not in the mood to talk to anyone, but I couldn't let things go on like this," Rachel said, her tone calm but firm. "I know what Vanessa did to you, and I'm so sorry. It's not an excuse, but I need you to know there's more to the story." She didn't act alone, Julian. Julian felt his pulse quicken, a rush of confusion and disbelief washing over him. "What do you mean? What more is there to know? I'm not asking you to forgive her, but you deserve to understand the truth," Rachel continued. "There's someone else involved in this, someone who..." The line went dead. Julian blinked in disbelief, staring at his phone, wondering if it had just been a cruel prank. He immediately dialed Rachel's number again, but it went straight to voicemail. What had she been about to say? Who was this mysterious person she had hinted at? The one who had been involved in Vanessa's deception? He felt a sickening twist in his stomach. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of this new puzzle. Who could have been involved in betraying him? And why was Rachel coming forward now, after all this time? Unable to shake the questions, Julian decided to wait. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. After all, he had already been deceived once before, and he wasn't eager to fall into that trap again. But something about Rachel's words lingered in his mind. If there was someone else, someone who had been pulling the strings behind Vanessa's actions, then perhaps there was more to the story than he had ever known. That night, Julian barely slept. His thoughts were consumed by Rachel's cryptic message, and he couldn't quiet the growing sense that his life, once marked by betrayal, was now on the brink of another, even deeper revelation. The next morning, as if by fate, Julian's phone rang again. It was Rachel. "Julian, I'm sorry about last night," she said, sounding more anxious than before. "I didn't mean to hang up on you, but I need you to hear me out. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I wasn't sure how to tell you everything. Tell me everything." Julian repeated, the anger and confusion in his voice evident. "What the hell is going on, Rachel? What's this about?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Rachel finally spoke again. "Julian," she began, her voice trembling, "Vanessa wasn't just in debt. She was being pressured by someone who had ties to a much larger operation, someone who threatened her, manipulated her into doing things she didn't want to do." The words sent a jolt through Julian, his heart racing. "What do you mean? Who are you talking about?" "It's my father," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's been involved in some shady business for years. Money laundering, blackmail. He's dangerous, Julian. And Vanessa got caught in the middle of it. She was desperate, trying to keep me out of it, trying to protect me. And she thought marrying you would be her way out." Julian's mind spun. He could hardly process what Rachel was saying. The man Vanessa had married him to escape was her own father. He had been so blind, so naive to not even question why Vanessa had been so secretive about her past. But to think she had been living in fear of a man like that, of someone capable of such manipulation and control, it all made sense in the most twisted way. "So, you're telling me that Vanessa was trying to protect you?" Julian asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "She never told me any of this. She used me to get away from him." Rachel's voice broke. "I'm so sorry, Julian. She didn't want you to be involved in any of this, but it got out of hand. And now she's paying the price for her choices." Julian was silent for a long moment, trying to process everything he had just heard. The truth was overwhelming, but it also brought with it a strange sense of clarity. Vanessa's actions, as cruel as they had been, hadn't come from a place of malice. They had been born from desperation and fear. She had been trapped, manipulated by a man who had no conscience. Finally Julian spoke, his voice soft but steady. "I don't know what to think anymore, Rachel, but I'm going to need time. I can't just forgive her. Not yet. I need to figure out what's next for me." Rachel's tone soft. "Take all the time you need, Julian. But please know that she never meant to hurt you. She loved you. She just didn't know how to escape." The words hung in the air as Julian hung up the phone. He didn't know if he believed everything Rachel had said, but something in her voice had convinced him that there was more to this story than he had ever realized. As he sat there, staring at the wall, Julian felt a deep, unsettled sense of realization settle over him. His world had been shattered, but somehow he had started to see it all more clearly. The path forward would be hard, but it was his own path to choose now. Julian's life had unraveled in ways he hadn't expected, but as each layer of deceit was peeled back, he started to wonder, was it possible to rebuild from the rubble? The truth that had emerged over the past few weeks had both freed him and shackled him. Vanessa's betrayal, though still a cruel blow, now felt like a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit perfectly, but were beginning to form a clearer picture. Yet, as much as Rachel's revelations had shed light on the darkness, Julian knew he wasn't finished confronting the reality of what he had lost. His mornings were quieter now. He woke up without the pressure of pretending that everything was fine. The silence in his apartment was profound, each day feeling like a slow crawl through an endless tunnel of recovery. For the first time in what felt like forever, Julian was allowing himself to feel every emotion. The anger, the sadness, the disbelief, and strangely enough, the relief. He no longer had to live in the shadow of Vanessa's secretive past or her complex motivations. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he had his own work to do, too. The fact that Vanessa had been trying to protect Rachel by keeping him in the dark was something he couldn't ignore. He had been part of that web, entangled in something he hadn't seen, but that didn't mean he was free from his own choices. Yet what struck him most as the days passed was how little he actually knew about his own desires and goals. It wasn't just about Vanessa anymore, it was about him, too. Who had he been in their relationship? And who was he now without her by his side? Julian had to answer these questions, but he wasn't sure how to begin. So he started small. He threw himself into work. His job had always been a stable source of income, but it had also been something he used to distract himself from his personal life. Now he tried to use it as a tool for healing. Long hours at the office gave him a reason to wake up, a routine to follow. He found himself growing more detached from the emotions that had once overwhelmed him, as if he were encased in a bubble of mechanical normalcy. He had no answers, but at least, for a brief while, he could pretend he had some semblance of control. But life, as it often does, had a way of pushing him out of his comfort zone. One afternoon, just as he was leaving his office, he received a message, an unexpected text from Vanessa. His fingers hesitated over the screen, unsure whether he should even open it. The memories of her were still fresh, her face still haunting his thoughts, even after everything. Yet something inside him told him to read it. "Julian, I need to speak to you. I know you're probably angry with me, and you have every right to be, but there's still so much you don't know. I can't explain it all over text. Please, just give me a chance to explain. Meet me tomorrow at the park, the one near the lake. Please, I need to see you. Vanessa." Julian felt a surge of conflicting emotions. A part of him wanted to throw his phone across the room and ignore her completely. But another part of him, the part that had loved her so deeply and lost everything because of her, wanted to hear her out. What could she possibly say that would change anything? Did he even want answers anymore? He couldn't shake the thought of her pleading voice on the phone. Rachel's revelation about her father's influence, the way Vanessa had looked at him that day in the cafe. There was more to the story. He knew it. But was it worth reopening that chapter of his life? Julian walked home that evening in a daze. He had already made the decision to meet her, though part of him regretted it the moment the thought crossed his mind. He could already feel the emotional weight of it, the consequences of reopening the door he had so carefully closed. The next day he arrived at the park early. The lake was peaceful, its surface reflecting the soft blue sky. Julian stood near the edge, his hands buried in his pockets, watching the water ripple gently. He hadn't been to this park in years, but the memories of their time there of long walks, deep conversations, were still vivid. Vanessa appeared a few minutes later, her head slightly down, as if she were ashamed to face him. She looked different, her face pale and drawn, but there was something familiar in the way she carried herself. Julian couldn't help but notice the signs of stress, the way her shoulders slumped as she approached him. She was nervous, her eyes darting around the park before locking onto his. "Julian," she said, her voice quiet. "I didn't think you'd come." He said nothing at first, only studied her. There were so many emotions tangled in him, so many questions that he wasn't sure how to ask. But something about seeing her, standing before him, brought a rush of memories, and for a moment it all felt so familiar. Finally, he spoke. "What is it, Vanessa? What's so important that you needed to see me again?" She took a deep breath, visibly shaking. "I'm sorry for everything. For the lies, the deceit. For dragging you into something you never should have been a part of. But you have to understand there's more to this than just my father. It wasn't just about money or protection. It was about me, about the person I became. I didn't know who I was anymore. And I lost myself in trying to please everyone, especially you." Julian couldn't help but feel the weight of her words. Was she trying to explain herself, or was she seeking forgiveness? The ambiguity in her voice left him torn between the desire to walk away and the need to hear her out. He had so many questions, but the biggest one on his mind was this. Had she ever really loved him, or had he been just another pawn in her game? "I need to know," Julian said, his voice steady but filled with an edge of pain. "Did you ever love me? Or was I just part of some escape plan? Was everything a lie?" Vanessa looked at him, her eyes filled with guilt and regret. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For a moment they stood in silence, the world around them continuing as though nothing had changed. Then she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I loved you, Julian. I really did. But I didn't know how to love myself. And that's the hardest thing I've ever had to admit." Her words hit Julian like a punch to the gut. He wanted to scream, to yell at her for the pain she had caused him, but instead he stood there, processing her confession, trying to make sense of it all. The past few months had been a whirlwind, and he was still trying to catch his breath. And then, as quickly as it all started, it became clear to Julian. The healing he had been seeking wasn't going to come from her words. It would come from within himself. Vanessa was no longer the person he had believed her to be, but that didn't mean he couldn't move forward. "I need to go," Julian said quietly. "I can't keep living in the past. It's time for me to move on for my own sake." He turned and walked away, his heart heavy, but his mind clearer than it had been in months. Julian's days following his conversation with Vanessa felt different, though not in the way he had hoped. It wasn't a sense of finality, but more like a quiet, unsettling understanding that he couldn't escape the past as easily as he had once believed. The peace he thought he would feel after closing that chapter eluded him. Instead, he found himself adrift, floating through days that seemed endless, filled with both reflection and regret. He couldn't deny the weight of the memories. Those early days with Vanessa had been filled with hope, promise, and a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in a long time. They had been a team, or so he thought. She had made him feel seen and loved, and for the first time in years, he had let someone in. But now the reality was far different. Her betrayal had cracked the foundation of everything he had believed in, and no matter how much he tried to rebuild it, the cracks remained. Julian didn't know what he was searching for. Was it redemption? Closure? Perhaps both, but they were elusive. He spent his days working, losing himself in the rhythm of daily life meetings, emails, coffee breaks, but his mind was never fully there. The weight of it all lingered, creeping into his thoughts even as he tried to keep it at bay. One afternoon, as Julian walked through the city streets on his lunch break, he found himself in front of a small cafe he used to visit regularly with Vanessa. He hesitated, his heart tightening in his chest. The memories of their laughter, their quiet moments shared over coffee, rushed back to him in a flood. But instead of feeling anger, he felt something else, something he hadn't expected. He felt sadness, the kind of deep, lingering sadness that couldn't be shaken, no matter how hard he tried. Julian stepped into the cafe, the familiar bell chiming above him as he entered. The barista behind the counter smiled at him, but it felt distant, as if the world had somehow shifted, and he was now a stranger in a place that had once been his sanctuary. He ordered a coffee and took a seat by the window, staring out at the bustling city. As the warm cup of coffee cradled his hands, Julian allowed himself to reflect. He thought about the choices he had made, about Vanessa and about the life he had envisioned. The idea of a future with her had seemed so real, so possible, but now it felt like a dream he would never be able to wake from. It wasn't just about what Vanessa had done. It was about what he had allowed to happen. He had put his trust in someone who hadn't been honest with him, and in doing so he had ignored the signs, the red flags that had been there all along. How could he have been so blind? The barista interrupted his thoughts, setting a fresh coffee in front of him with a soft smile. Julian nodded his thanks, but didn't engage. His mind was elsewhere, lost in a maze of thoughts and feelings he wasn't sure how to navigate. But there was something he had to confront, something that had been weighing on him since that conversation with Vanessa. The truth was, he didn't know how to let go, how to forgive, how to move forward. Later that evening, as Julian sat in his apartment, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his messages. He had avoided them for days, not wanting to face any more confrontations, but tonight he felt the need to. There it was again, a message from Rachel. "Julian, I know you probably want nothing to do with us, but I need to say something. I've been thinking about everything that happened, and I don't think you know the whole story. I can't explain everything, but please know that you were never the problem. You were always kind to me, and I can't let you think that you were at fault. Please, call me if you can." Her words hit him harder than he expected. Julian hadn't wanted to hear from Rachel, not after everything that had happened. But her message felt different, genuine. She was telling him that he wasn't to blame, something he hadn't heard from anyone else, and that was all he needed to hear. He picked up the phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed her number. It rang once, twice, and then Rachel answered, her voice tentative but warm. "Julian?" "Rachel," he said, his voice hoarse. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I never wanted any of this to happen." "I know you didn't," Rachel replied softly, "but I needed you to hear it from me. Vanessa's actions were her own, and I don't want you to carry the weight of it. She made choices that hurt both of us, but it wasn't your fault." Julian sat back against the couch, letting her words sink in. The burden he had been carrying, the guilt, seemed to lift, even if just a little. Rachel wasn't asking for his forgiveness, but she was offering him something far more important: the truth. She wasn't asking him to fix what had been broken, just to understand that the responsibility didn't lie entirely with him. "I appreciate that, Rachel," Julian said, his voice steady. "I really do, and I'm sorry for everything, for not seeing things clearly sooner. But I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to move forward." There was silence for a moment, and then Rachel spoke, her tone sincere. "You deserve to find happiness, Julian. Don't let her take that from you." "I won't," he replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I won't." That night, Julian allowed himself to sleep without the heavy weight of guilt or regret. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in months, he felt like he was on the path toward healing. It wasn't a straight line, and he wasn't sure where it would lead, but he was willing to take the next step. The days following his conversation with Rachel marked a significant shift in Julian's outlook. The weight of guilt that had once defined his every waking moment began to lift, gradually giving way to a new kind of clarity. It wasn't that he had forgiven himself entirely, or that he had found peace with everything that had happened. No, the road ahead was still long and uncertain. But for the first time in a while, Julian felt like he could breathe again. He took a long, hard look at his life and the direction it was heading. It had been so easy to let the past define him, to let the mistakes and betrayals shape who he was. But he realized now that he had been letting those things dictate his future, allowing the pain and disappointment to steal the possibility of something better. He wasn't sure what better looked like, but he was ready to find out. He started taking small steps, walking with purpose, not as a man bound by his past, but as someone trying to regain control over his life. He began going to therapy, something he had avoided for months, feeling like it was too much to face. But now, with Rachel's words echoing in his mind, he realized that he couldn't continue on his own. He needed help, and that was okay. There was no shame in trying to heal. The therapy sessions were difficult, often leaving him exhausted and emotionally drained. But with each session, Julian found himself peeling back the layers of his past, confronting the parts of himself he had kept hidden for so long. It was painful, but it was necessary. At work, things weren't much different. Julian had always prided himself on being professional, on keeping his personal life separate from his career. But now he realized that the two were deeply intertwined. His personal struggles had affected his work, his relationships with colleagues, and even his own sense of self-worth. He had been carrying a weight that he had tried to ignore, and it was starting to show. He began to communicate more openly with his team, acknowledging that he wasn't okay and asking for support when he needed it. The response was overwhelming. and it made him realize that vulnerability didn't make him weak. It made him human. Through all of this, Julian never stopped thinking about Vanessa. She was still there, lingering in the back of his mind. The memories of their time together were bittersweet moments of laughter, love, and connection mixed with the harsh reality of betrayal. He didn't know if he could ever truly forgive her, not for what she had done, but for how she had made him doubt himself. But he had stopped trying to understand her. He had stopped obsessing over her actions, over the things she had taken from him. He couldn't change the past, no matter how much he wanted to. All he could do now was move forward, and that was something Vanessa couldn't take from him. One evening, as he was leaving the office, Julian's phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. "I've been thinking a lot about you lately. I know you're working hard to move on, but I just wanted to remind you that you're not alone in this. You have people who care about you. Take it one day at a time. You'll get there." Julian smiled as he read the message. It was simple, but it was the kind of encouragement he needed. It was the kind of reminder that he wasn't as isolated as he had once felt. There were people in his life who cared, who wanted to see him thrive, not just survive. As he made his way home that night, Julian found himself looking at the city differently. The streets, once filled with reminders of his past, now felt like a new beginning. He could see the possibilities, the opportunities for growth, for change, for happiness. The journey wouldn't be easy, but it would be his journey, and that was enough. He stepped into his apartment, the familiar space that had been both a sanctuary and a prison, but now it felt like a place of potential. Julian had come a long way, but he knew he wasn't done yet. He had a long road ahead of him, but this time he was ready to face it with hope. The following weeks were filled with ups and downs, but Julian had finally come to terms with one crucial fact. He didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to know exactly where he was going. What mattered now was that he was moving forward. And in that movement, in the process of healing, Julian found something he hadn't expected, a sense of peace. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase the past, but it allowed him to breathe again, to hope again, and to believe that there was a future beyond the pain. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Julian decided to take a trip, a simple getaway, to clear his mind and recharge. It was something he had always wanted to do, but never had the courage to follow through on. He was nervous, of course. What if he wasn't ready? What if the ghosts of the past followed him? But he didn't let fear hold him back. He packed his bags and set off on a journey that wasn't about escaping his problems, but about facing them. He knew that he had a long way to go, but with each step he was learning how to embrace life on his own terms. The trip Julian took was not about running away from the life he was building. It was about giving himself the space to breathe, to think, and most importantly, to let go. The moment he stepped off the plane, he felt something in the air, something lighter than the heaviness that had weighed on him for so long. The small town he had chosen for his getaway was quiet, peaceful, a stark contrast to the bustling city life he was used to. For the first time in ages, Julian felt like he could hear his own thoughts without the constant buzz of worries and doubts. The stress of work, of his personal struggles, and the lingering questions about Vanessa, all of it seemed distant now. The simplicity of the place was calming. He spent his days walking through small trails, sitting by the lake, and reading books he had put off for years. He allowed himself to relax, something he hadn't known how to do in a long time. On the third evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow over the horizon, Julian sat on a bench by the water. His mind wandered, but this time it wasn't in a spiral of negativity. He thought of his past, of the mistakes he had made, but rather than feeling consumed by regret, he saw them for what they were, parts of his journey. He understood now that no single event could define who he was. The person he had been was not the person he was becoming. A soft breeze blew through the trees, and for the first time in a long while, Julian felt at peace with himself. He didn't need to know what the future held. He didn't need to have everything figured out. All he needed was to keep moving forward, one step at a time, trusting that things would fall into place as they should. That evening, Julian decided to call Rachel. He hadn't spoken to her much since that day, but she had remained in his thoughts, offering him support even from afar. He had no expectations when he dialed her number, just a quiet hope that they could reconnect. "Julian?" Rachel's voice sounded surprised but warm when she answered. "Hey, Rachel." "It's me," Julian said, his voice steady but calm. "I wanted to thank you for everything." Rachel didn't immediately respond, but he could hear the shift in her tone. "Thank me?" "Julian, you don't have to do that. I'm just glad you're taking care of yourself." "I am," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about everything, about where I've been, where I'm going. I think I'm finally starting to understand what it means to move on." There was a pause, a soft exhale on the other end of the line. "I'm glad to hear that. It's not easy, I know, but you're stronger than you think." Julian smiled, though he was alone by the lake, the sound of the water softly lapping against the shore. "I don't know if I'm strong," he admitted, "but I'm trying. I'm learning, and maybe that's enough for now." Rachel's voice softened. "It is. That's more than enough." As the conversation continued, Julian felt something settle in his chest, something he hadn't realized he was searching for. It wasn't closure, not exactly, but it was a kind of understanding, a recognition that he wasn't alone, that his past didn't have to define him, and that there was still a future to look forward to. The next day, as he prepared to head back to the city, Julian took one last walk by the lake. He stood there, taking in the beauty of the landscape, the quiet peace that surrounded him. There was no need for grand gestures or final revelations. He had made peace with himself, with the past, and with the people who had been part of his journey. When Julian returned to the city, he felt different, not in a dramatic, life-altering way, but in a subtle, fundamental shift. He no longer felt bound by his mistakes. He wasn't looking for answers from others or waiting for someone to fix things for him. He was moving forward on his own terms, with a renewed sense of purpose. At work, Julian found himself more engaged, more present. He had learned to communicate more openly with his colleagues, to listen without judgment, and to ask for help when needed. There was no longer a divide between his personal and professional life. They were interconnected, and he had learned to balance them. As for Vanessa, Julian no longer felt the need to dwell on her. The resentment, the confusion, and the heartbreak had all been part of his healing process, but they were no longer what defined him. He had released her from his thoughts, no longer holding her actions over his head like an anchor. She had been a chapter in his life, but she was no longer the author of his story. Rachel remained a steady presence in his life, though they had no specific expectations of what their relationship might become. They were friends, true, understanding friends, and that was enough for Julian. The journey he had been on, the challenges he had faced, had led him to a place where he understood that his value wasn't tied to anyone else's approval. It wasn't about finding someone to save him, it was about saving himself. Julian stood on the balcony of his apartment one evening, the city stretching out before him, a sea of lights and possibility. He had come so far, and yet he knew the journey was ongoing. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, but he no longer feared them. He was ready to face whatever came next. And for the first time in a long while, Julian allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a new beginning.